what that does, what it is. It's maybe about 25 years now since Arjun Appadurai published The Social Life of Things, which in some sense I take as the beginning of the current phase of commodity history. And after that, historians began to write the history of individual commodities. And now certainly at the level of popular history, we have histories of almost every commodity, from corn to coffee, from tea to tobacco, from cod to the colour mauve. And what's often claimed in the subtitles of these histories is that this individual commodity has had an enormous transformative effect. So, as I recall, it's cod, the history of a fish that changed the world. All these commodities changed the world. But as it were, my interest is, as it were, if they're all changing the world, as it were, how do we write a history that takes into account of all these transformative changes that are going on? I take Radio 4's current series, History of the World in 100 Objects, is yet another manifestation of this, although it's not always claimed as it changed the world. So it's led to a whole way of doing history, and of course there's a way of doing literary criticism known as theme theory, which is, as it were, pushing at the same project in some way. And all of these things you could call manifestations of what Bruce Robbins has criticized, I suppose, as commodity fetishism in contemporary history. And he's arguing that actually, as it were, the fetishism of the commodity is basically uncritical. These things may change the world, but as it were, that it's part of a commodity culture that's producing these commodity histories. And obviously he's looking back to an earlier Marxist history which had a more critical view. So what I just want to reflect on really is that, and also the particular title of this conference, which is Commodities in Motion, which is a very bodily metaphor. I suppose it's suitably for the anatomy theatre. Sounds rather clinical to me. I take it that it's in some sense allying itself to a more typical phrase, which would be commodities in circulation. And in fact, today we've had people who've been talking about notes in circulation, text in circulation, and this idea of circulation, the movement of commodities, interests me particularly, though, what the relation is between, as it were, the movement of these individual commodities and the other kind of commodity that was circulated, certainly in the 19th century, which is human beings. And what I'm not sure of, if you like, is really the links between, as it were, the human and the material commodities, and what interaction they produced. I was trying to think about that in that last book that Regenia mentioned, which is really, in some sense, a book about the commodification of Englishness. I was trying to, as it were, make links between these different forms of commodification somewhere in the introduction. If you don't mind, I'll just read a paragraph, a couple of sentences from that. Trying to put these different forms of circulation together, because in the 19th century, Britain, as we heard, was of course a huge manufacturing exporter, but it was also a huge exporter of people. And one of the things that is not often reflected about the British Isles is that it's probably, so it's computed actually, the largest exporter of people historically that there has been. It's just that people tend not to focus on the export of people as being, in fact, one of Britain's major industries, certainly in the 19th century. It's a major form of production and export. So what I say is, so the English performed a counterpoint to their own economic system of global circulation, whereas commodities and raw materials such as cotton flowed into London from all over the world to be then re-exported back to their countries of origin as manufactured goods. So also raw English people from abroad came to London for finishing before they returned to their point of origin as more wholly English, while the over-civilized city dwellers of England flowed abroad to take up the life of yeoman farmers in the great open spaces of the colonies, and so restored themselves and their country to a rude health by attaching themselves to the soil of foreign fields. So there was, as it were, there was indeed a circulation. I take Henry James actually as being the apogee of this form of circulation, where people, as it were, Anglophiles, people wanting to be English, came to London to refine their Englishness, while meanwhile the working class were exported to get back to health because they were so sick from living in industrial cities and so forth. Now that was a sort of circular movement, but actually it wasn't like money. It wasn't, as it were, a perpetual circulation. Basically, there are different kinds of movements involved in commodities, which really can be relatively restricted. There is movement, but actually there is settlement too, certainly people. And what interests me is what was the relation between them? How far did the movement of exchange of goods affect the required movement and exchange of people and vice versa? And what kind of general international frameworks were in place that facilitated this movement, which is what we've already heard some discussion of. In other words, what material infrastructures were developed that facilitated this vast global movement of people and goods? And I think that's one of the things that hasn't really been adequately addressed in commodity history, which is how commodities kept whizzing around the globe. I mean, it takes a lot of organisation at a lot of different levels, because there's the financial, legal structures that facilitated trade, there are the institutional structures that validated and supported them. And the work of someone like Lauren Benton, for example, in her two books, Law and Colonial Cultures, Legal Regimes in World History, and her more recent book, The Search for Sovereignty, I think has given us some sense of the complexity of what the global imperial networks looked like when viewed from the infrastructural perspective, sovereignty in particular, law in particular. And what interests me about that is that actually from as it were, work as a historian, she's actually able to question many of the theoretical and philosophical arguments that are or have been made recently, particularly in the light of people reading Giorgio Agamben. She's been able to question a lot of discussions about sovereignty at the level of political theory, particularly, for example, the argument that colonialism was a state of exception. And what I think this network should be organising, should be aiming for, is really something like that, which is historical work that has the power to demand change at a conceptual, theoretical level, as it were, for that work to make us rethink these more infrastructural concepts. So basically, there are two related questions. What are the material, invisible infrastructural frameworks that are in place to facilitate all this, and what theoretical frameworks of our own do we assume and utilise when analysing them, which actually all these individual local perspectives might challenge. Now, one of these local perspectives, it seems to me, is that, as I've suggested, we're much better at looking at the history of individual commodities, whether of goods or of people, than at the interactions between them, and the ways that they produced effects on each other and on the economies and the ecologies in which they intervene. And there's only one commodity history that I know of that really attempts to do that, as it were, to relate all these different levels in all their complexities. And that's a book that was published in 1940, many years before commodity history emerged on the academic scene, by the Cuban anthropologist Fernando Ortiz, in Contrapunteo Cubano, or in English, Cuban Counterpoint, Tobacco and Sugar. It's a history of Cuba, and at the same time it's a history of the commodities that made Cuba, tobacco and sugar. And it was in that book that Ortiz coined the neologism transculturation to describe the material effects on Cuban history of the importation and then the cultivation of tobacco and sugar on the island. And he relates the dialectical role of those two commodities with respect to the history of human transculturations that also have made up Cuban history. This is what he says. I've chosen the word transculturation to express the highly varied phenomena that have come about in Cuba as a result of the extremely complex transmutations of culture that have taken place here, without a knowledge of which it's impossible to understand the evolution of the Cuban people, either in the economic or in the institutional, legal, ethical, religious, artistic, linguistic, psychological, sexual, or other aspects of life. The real history of Cuba is the history of its intermeshed transculturations. And that attempt to write a history of intermeshed transculturations, I think, for me, is the important part of that book. Now, transculturation as a concept has been used and appropriated by a number of commentators, but actually, I think it's rarely appropriated in the full scope of what Ortiz himself describes. And this may be, it may be because actually the English version of his book is an abridged version. It's only about half the length of the original. So a lot, as it were, if you only read it in English, a lot's missing. But also because his writing style cuts across different disciplines, because it's at once anthropological, it's historical, and it's also extremely poetic, and therefore hard to emulate. But what he proposes most of all is the idea that the movement of people and the production and circulation of commodities is at least a two-way process. First of all, it involves forms of severance, of detachment, production, as a movement from place of origin, followed by what he calls a process of disadjustment and readjustment, of deculturation, acculturation, in a word, transculturation. Transculturation describes the process of accommodation both by the commodity or the person as commodity and the cultural milieu in which they arrive. It's that two-way process, the impact, if you like, it's the impact factor in modern higher education speak, of commodities. They don't only circulate, they impact. And it traces the effect of this in the different phases of transition as culture moves according to its interaction with commodification. And it's that, he says, that produces new cultural phenomena, which he calls neoculturation. So there's a constant process of detachment, of transformation and production. So the point is really that the circulation of commodities, or the production of commodities, and the consumption of commodities produces new material and cultural environments at every end of the transaction, every end of the process. And in the case of Cuba, it's the counterpoint, as he calls it, the dialectical relation between tobacco and sugar in their contrasting qualities as commodities. And he makes a wonderful play on the, as it were, the dialectical binary of tobacco and sugar as being light and dark, sweet and bitter, white and black, and by extension, free, slave, woman, man. He keeps elaborating more and more qualities that these products have that as it were, impact on the cultural environment, together with their different labour relations of production, the forms of their consumption, the different effects on the Cuban environment. And it's through that he traces the specific history of Cuba. But not only of Cuba, because the other half of the book is actually, as it were, the other impact, which is that the transculturation, that the importation of those two commodities produced back into Europe, tobacco and sugar, transforming the cultures of Europe, both in social terms, obviously, but also in economic terms, as it were, for example, the effect of sugar on the British economy in the 18th century, for example. So it's that sort of dynamic, contrapuntal perspective, I think, on commodities in motion, in production and in consumption, which, however hard it has been for anybody to repeat, and I don't think anybody has ever been able to do it, but nevertheless, that's what it seems to me we should be trying to achieve in our network group.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks very much. I was thinking, when Paul was giving his paper, about what the word game of settlement would look like, rather than adventure, word game of settlement. So thank you very much. I'm going to open it right up to the floor. There's a lot to talk about in